Hi, this is Mark Birch, and this is quick revision of Macbeth Act 2, Scene 1. The act begins the same night that Act 1 ended, but a little later. And in order to establish that period in which it's set, the opening utterance by Banquo is "How goes the night, boy?" We need to recognise the significance of this for contemporary plays in the Jacobean period would be performed during the day with no lighting, no set to speak of, so the speech would be required to indicate the different kind of temporal settings. We know it's night because Banquo tells us it's night. After a brief conversation with his son, Fleance, in order to establish quite how late it is, Banquo says, "Hold, take my sword, there's husbandry in heaven." Now, there are a couple of things we need to recognise about this. First of all, the word husbandry is quite low frequency. It basically means economy, being thrifty. So, essentially, the heavens have been economical because they haven't put out many stars. Their candles are all out. So we've got stars as metaphorical candles here. In other words, it's really dark. And this doesn't bode well, hence why you could argue that this is an example of prophetic fallacy. The darkness, not even darkness that's lit by the light of the stars, is really profound. It echoes Lady Macbeth's "come thick night." It's something that shrouds the actions that are taking place and would be quite ominous in terms of its tone. The simile employed by Banquo is interesting. "A heavy summons lies like lead upon me, and yet I would not sleep," because it seems to show how desperate Banquo is for sleep. He's got this heavy summons, but he's trying to avoid it. And what we need to consider is why he might want to avoid it. He goes on to explain this. But sleep is one of the play's most significant motifs. Sleep being removed, or being unable to sleep, or having disturbed sleep, we see running throughout the play. I'd argue that what Shakespeare's doing is drawing a contrast between Macbeth and Banquo through their different responses to those kinds of cursed thoughts that have been inspired by the witches. They're cursed thoughts because they're thoughts that are associated with murder and the unnatural. Banquo is praying for some kind of divine or godly support when he's vulnerable during sleep. He can fend off these terrible thoughts when he's awake, but he needs kind of divine assistance when he's asleep and therefore vulnerable to the influence of evil. Macbeth, of course, isn't only trying to not fight off these kind of cursed thoughts, he's actually engaging with them and is currently on his way to put them into action. It's also worth considering from a dramatic perspective the choices that a director has with regard to what the second thing is that Banquo gives to Fleance. We know he's given him his sword, but then he says, "Take thee that too." So what is this second thing? Is it a cloak to keep Fleance warm, to demonstrate his love for his son and the compassion of Banquo? Is it a dagger, showing that Banquo has given all of his weapons to Fleance because he's comfortable in Macbeth's castle? He doesn't believe there's going to be any wrongdoing towards him. Is it a torch or something? We know it's the middle of the night. They're probably going to be carrying some kind of light source, and he hands it over to Fleance while he has a big yawn or something like that that introduces the heavy summons that he's drawn to in order to sleep. We just don't know, and it's one of those ways in which the ambiguity of Shakespeare's language is really interesting in terms of the form of it as a play. Directors have choices, and whatever choice is made, it can create a different response to a particular character or a particular context. Banquo says, "I dreamt last night of the three weird sisters," and Macbeth's response is, "I think not of them." So you get the honesty of Banquo, those concerns that he's had and articulated a moment before show his trustworthiness to an audience, while the audience recognises Macbeth's deceitfulness. This is another example of dramatic irony. As soon as Macbeth says, "I think not of them," the audience has an almost pantomime response of, "Oh, yes, you do." So we recognise that Macbeth is lying even to his closest friend. This, of course, would appeal to James I, who is going to be an audience of the play. James traced his lineage back to Banquo, so anything that represents Banquo as honourable, trustworthy, etc., is essentially going to be flattering to the king. And I think Shakespeare would have been profoundly aware of this in the writing of the play. The original source material, Holinshed, doesn't present Banquo in a similar way to the way that Shakespeare does. And we see more of it here. Macbeth asks Banquo to cleave to my consent, to stick to my plans. And if he does, that it will make honour for him. Banquo's response, however, is interesting. He says, so I lose none in seeking to augment it, but still keep my bosom franchised and allegiance clear, I shall be counselled. In other words, even though Macbeth has kind of used this as an opportunity to test Banquo's loyalty, suggesting that he will honour him if he goes along with what Macbeth has proposed in the future, Banquo's response shows that he's distrustful of Macbeth already. Those first words, so I lose none, so I lose no honour by following your plans, so I lose no honour in listening to you, as long as I don't lose any of that honour, I will be counselled, I will listen to you. But the first words he said kind of suggest that he may lose honour, that there is an uncertainty there. Following the departure of Fleance and Banquo, Macbeth begins a soliloquy that's one of the most famous soliloquies in Macbeth. Is this a dagger which I see before me? Now, there are a couple of different directorial choices that can be made regarding the presentation of this dagger, both of which would give different indications of its origins that makes it significant. The most common approach is that the audience can't see the dagger. It is, therefore, a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain, or at least that's the most likely interpretation of it, because we as an audience can't see the dagger that Macbeth sees. That therefore makes it seem that it's an hallucination that's produced by the stress and pressure, the act of regicide that he's about to commit. He tries to reach out and touch it, he can't touch it. However, I have seen productions where the audience is actually shown the dagger. And in that, it makes it much more likely to interpret the dagger as a product of the supernatural, something that's created by the witches to lead Macbeth, to cajole him into the murder of Duncan. So if he has any last-minute doubts, which we see that he may do in a moment, that they're quashed by the supernatural influence that's made upon him. It can look pretty pants. The last thing you want is a dagger being dangled on some fishing line in front of someone. It doesn't have the right kind of gravitas to suggest a kind of supernatural apparition. So maybe best in film rather than on stage. Macbeth clearly draws a parallel between the dagger of the mind and the dagger that he intended to use to kill Duncan. He says it was such an instrument that I was to use, and thou marshallest me the way that I was going. So the origins are crucial to an appreciation of those influences on Macbeth. Is this something that's a product of his own mind, or is it something that's a product of the supernatural? I'd argue that Macbeth's doubts about the provenance of the dagger, where it's from, is it supernatural, is it a figment of his own imagination, echo his own doubts about the murder of Duncan, the act of regicide. This kind of gothic imagery represents the guilt that he feels even before he actually commits this terrible act. The rest of Macbeth's soliloquy is dominated by gothic imagery. And I think this is important because it shows the nature of his own internal processes. He believes himself to be evil in this act. He identifies himself with various things such as witchcraft, the wolf, Tarquin, ghosts, all of which are associated with evil, and he recognises that what he's about to do is, in a similar vein, evil. Just as an aside, it's worth noting that this aspect of the soliloquy bears striking similarities to Shakespeare's narrative poem, The Rape of Lucretia. Before the bell rings to symbolise that Macbeth must commit the act, he states, "Whiles I fret he lives, words to the heat of deeds too cold breath gives." In other words, while he's thinking, while he's procrastinating, he could be cooling the passions that are required in order to commit an act like this. and it's worth recognising that idea of overcoming the idea of procrastination, because this is something that Macbeth returns to later. Okay, ta.